Gregor Mendel is someone that we often refer to as the father of genetics. He was an Augustinian friar who studied the dichotomous traits of a line of pea plants. So he had his pea plants and he would breed them with each other and observe the traits the offspring would demonstrate. And what he discovered is that his plants could pass on traits to their offspring that were not present in themselves, or seemingly not present in themselves. So basically what he discovered is that these plants had hidden traits. They had traits that they had received from their parents, but did not show. And this initial discovery eventually came to be what we call the difference between genotype and phenotype. Genotype refers to what's actually in your genes, like the entire content of your genetic code. Phenotype, on the other hand, that only refers to the portion of your genetic code that's actually being expressed. These are those physical, behavioral, and psychological features that result from interactions with the environment. So the environment would trigger the expression of these parts of your genetic code. Now, the term gene has a specific definition. It refers to a group of nucleotide bases. It's basically just chemicals that provide a specific set of biochemical instructions. And all aspects of human physiology and psychology is encoded into these instructions. And that's kind of an interesting point to think about for just a minute. It's normally when we think about genetics, we think about like skin color, we think about height, we think about physical stuff. But genetics also plays a major role when it comes to things like personality and aggressiveness and stuff like that. So it's not just physiology here, it's psychology as well. Now, humans have about 20,500 different genes organized into 23 pairs that we call chromosomes. And these chromosome pairs, each individual part of that pair is called an allele. So one set comes from the mother and one set comes from the father. So you have the father's alleles and the mother's alleles. So all an allele is a variation of a gene. Now, when you get your genetic code from your mother and your father, it's kind of like having two separate sets of instructions. You could build a person with either set of instructions alone, but we have two sets, and those sets can either be homozygous or heterozygous. To call alleles homozygous means that they're the same. The instructions on that particular part of the genetic code are identical. Like maybe you got a blue eye trait from your mother and a blue eye trait from your father, for example. Heterozygous alleles, though, that's where it starts to get interesting, because when alleles are heterozygous, there's a difference between them. Like maybe you got a brown eye trait from your mother and a blue from your father. So when there's that difference, one of the two alleles will be expressed and the other one will be hidden, just like Mendel's pea plants. But how this works out, how it's determined which one is expressed and which one is hidden, is really, really interesting. It's kind of hard to predict in some cases, but the trait that is expressed is what we call the dominant trait, and the trait that is not expressed is called the recessive trait. So you still have both in there. It's just the recessive one is hidden. So take this example. Here's a picture of me with my nephew. Just for your reference, my brother looks identical, basically, to me. He doesn't have a cool beard like I do, but he basically looks the same. So as you could tell, this kid looks very little like me. It looks very little like the father. And that's because certain traits, a lot of Asian traits in particular, tend to dominate Caucasian traits. And other traits that tend to dominate tend to be darker tones. So like darker hair color, darker eye color, those also tend to dominate in humans. But it's a lot more complicated than just, simple things like darker colors dominate. There's a lot of complexity when it comes to this dominance and recessive like hierarchy. But let's consider my own family. So here is me and my wife, and you can see our phenotypes just by looking at us. So you can see their hair color, eye color, skin color, and so on. Now, you can't see a person's genotype simply by looking at them, but we can probably make some good guesses. Like, we know that blue eye trait, that's recessive. So you would only show blue eyes if you had 2 blues. Because remember, blue will be dominated by basically any other color. So I have to have 2 blues. If I had 1 brown in there, if I had a brown allele, then I wouldn't have blue eyes. So I know for certain I have 2 blue traits. My wife, on the other hand, she does have brown eyes, so we don't know for certain if she has a blue in there. Maybe she does, maybe she doesn't. But let's just assume that she has 1 brown and a recessive blue. If this is true, then it should be possible for us to have a blue-eyed child. On our first attempt, unfortunately, we failed. You know, he's a cute kid. I love the kid. Don't get me wrong, but we didn't get blue eyes in this case. So maybe it's because he got a brown trait from the mother and a blue from me. He has to get a blue from me because that's all I have. So it's her fault. So on our second attempt, we seem to have been successful here. Now our child does have blue eyes, so that strongly implies that she got a blue from the mother and a blue from me as well. But these are only 2 of the 4 possible outcomes. If you take a look at this, you can see that there's 2 other possible combinations. In outcome 1, we have trait 1 from the mother, trait 1 from the father. Outcome 2 is trait 2 from the mother and 1 from the father. So then 3 would logically be 1 from the mother and 2 from the father. And then outcome 4 would be 2 and 2. So in this particular case, there's a 50-50 chance. There's a probability of 0.5 of one of our children being born with blue eyes. So that's how this kind of dominance works when it comes to alleles. You know, these 2 sets of chemical instructions will basically, you know, through instructions that aren't fully, like, really easy to explain, they will determine which one gets expressed and which one does not. Now, these sets of instructions, these pairs that we call chromosomes, are just these thread-like structures. And you can find them in the nuclei of all of your body cells. And these structures are just packed full of genetic material. Now, the first 23 pairs are something we call autosomes, and the 23rd is something we often call the sex chromosome. That's what determines the sex of the child. And each chromosome consists of a single molecule of deoxyribonucleic acid that is tightly wrapped around itself. So if you want to think of it this way, when it all comes down to it, all the detailed instructions for making a person can just be reduced to a set of chemicals in a particular order. And that deoxyribonucleic acid, or more commonly referred to as DNA, it's just 4 different chemicals in different combinations. That's literally all it is. It's adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine in different orders, leading to all the diversity of not just human life, but all life, period. Every living thing on the planet, every living thing we've ever discovered has the exact same 4 chemicals, but in a different order. So that's kind of a neat thing to think about. You know, it's a lot of sci-fi writers and movies and whatnot have speculated about whether or not it's possible even to have life, like a life form, that doesn't have these 4 basic chemicals. Like, is this what life is on its most basic form? Is it just these 4 chemicals in different orders? Or is there more to this? It's just an interesting thought. Now, when parents do combine their genes, when these 2 sets of alleles come together, in order for that to happen, you have to create a new strand. You have to create something to be placed into these reproductive cells to, join together. So what we're talking about now is something called genetic replication, when you copy a genetic code. And basically the way it works, if you've ever seen like a depiction of DNA, it looks kind of like a ladder or like a twisted zipper. And it's better to think of it as a zipper because that's how replication works. It unzips the genetic code, and then due to basic chemistry and physics, a duplicate, two identical copies result from that. Because I don't remember the exact combinations, but these different chemicals can only fit together in a particular way. So when you unzip it, the chemicals kind of just automatically attract the one that they've recently been disconnected from. And there's a lot of free-floating chemicals in there, so it's just like falling into place, just naturally. There's no thought process behind it. But it's not perfect. Like I said, there's no intelligence, there's no thought process behind it. It's just basic physics and chemistry. And when you leave it up to these kinds of forces, there is in fact room for error. And that's how you get mutations. Genetic replication is a very messy business. Every single time genetic code is copied, numerous errors are made. But these mistakes are usually pretty insignificant. Usually you'll never even notice that you're a mutant. But the truth is, everybody is. Every single living thing on the planet is a mutant. They have little tiny pieces of their genetic code that are unique to them. It's not exactly 50-50 of the two parents. There's a small portion that has been altered due to just genetic replication error. And this is an important fact because this is in fact how evolution is possible. If it wasn't for this messiness of genetic replication, species would never change over generation. We would not have the diversity of life that we do today if genetic replication was perfect. But mutations, like I said, they're usually pretty minor and you're not going to notice it. But over many, many generations, those mutations can, build upon each other, and you can get distant descendants that are quite different from you. Now, if you're interested in genetics and DNA, if you think this kind of stuff is really neat, I certainly do, because it helps us to understand what it is to be a living thing and how living things work. And there's the promise of being able to rearrange genetic code to create new kinds of living things. That's exactly the kind of research that's going on right now. If you've never heard of techniques like CRISPR, it's basically like scissors and glue for DNA. They can cut out pieces of DNA and put in new pieces of DNA to result in new, artificial mutations for that particular organism. And like I said, if this sounds interesting to you, you should look into what's called the Human Genome Project. This is an internationally funded effort to map the locations of all the different human genes so that we can understand the role these genes play in things like development, health, and illness. For the vast majority of the genetic code that we've been studying for many, many years, we still don't understand what it's for. We're still learning quite a lot. So maybe you can be a part of that. Maybe you can help us to fully understand the human genome if you want to get involved in this kind of research. But when it comes to understanding your own genes, like if we fully understood what was in a person's genes, if you think about it, that could lead to both harm and good. For example, like maybe we look at your genetic code, maybe a medical doctor looks at your genetic code and sees that you're at high risk for a particular kind of cancer. Well, maybe then they could take preventative measures to try to make sure you stay healthy. That's an example of how this could be used for a very good reason. But it could also be used for bad reasons. Like maybe your employer or potential employer or even the government or the police force would like to look at your genetic code and see if you have a predisposition for aggression or antisocial behavior. So yeah, it gets kind of scary, but that's how it is with science. With science, it's just a tool. Whether you use it for harm or for good, that's up for society, but science can provide us with these tools to either do great things or terrible things. Now, to change the subject slightly, I mentioned a bit about mutations and things like that and how everybody's a little bit different. That is, in fact, one kind of disorder, genetic disorder. So, for example, you might have abnormal chromosomes, like maybe you have extra chromosomes or missing or damaged chromosomes, and this could result in a wide range of disorders from things like Down syndrome, Turner syndrome, or Klinefelter syndrome, just to name a few. So these are disorders that are the result of these kinds of mutations. But then other disorders that are related to genetics are not mutations. They are in fact inherited. So these are things you got from your parents, and you can actually screen your parents to see if they had it, and then that would suggest that you probably have it, and if you have kids, they'll probably have it too. So now we're talking about things like sickle cell disease and phenylketonuria, or PKU. And typically these genetic disorders, because they could really, mess up your development and be a serious health risk, they do tend to be recessive. This is why they get passed on. Parents never show any symptoms, they have kids, and then their kids suffer for it. So it's a terrible thing, and they don't realize that they are responsible. They passed on those genes. And that's how most of these genetic disorders go. They do tend to be recessive. There is one big exception, though, and that's called Huntington's disease. Huntington's disease is dominant. So if you inherit this from your parents, you will suffer. 100% of the time you will suffer if you have inherited it. The only reason why this works, the only reason why this doesn't get kind of filtered out by evolution is that you don't start to really suffer from Huntington's disease until you get older, until you get past the point where you've probably already passed on your genes and started to raise a family. Now, as I mentioned, you could yourself get involved in this kind of research. And if you like genetics, if you like biology, and you also like psychology, the kind of research you would probably end up doing is called behavioral genetics, a branch of genetics that studies inheritance of behavioral and psychological traits. Now, behavioral genetics, just in general, is very difficult to do because most of the traits we're interested in are the result of many genes working together. So, we have this whole idea in our head that we can, look at your genetic code and find that little portion of it that, tells us your eye color or your aggressiveness or whatever. But in truth, it's kind of like this little bit and this little bit, and then on a separate chromosome, another little bit and another little bit, and we're trying to connect all these dots and figure out how they're related. This is what we call polygenetic inheritance, when phenotypes are the result of the combined activity of many separate genes, and that's why this can be very difficult to study. Now, you might be a clone. A lot of people are. When we use the word clone, what we're generally referring to are monozygotic twins. It's probably not so nice to call identical twins clones, but that's basically what they are. It's when you have a single egg and a single sperm that, for whatever reason, splits into two genetically identical individuals. We call them genetically identical because they do have incredibly similar genes, but remember, mutation is always a thing. So they are going to be slightly different. They are going to be mutated in slightly different ways at the genetic level, but you've probably never noticed that. The other kind of twins are what we call dizygotic or fraternal twins. This is just when two eggs and two sperm combine at the same time. So the mother releases two eggs instead of one, and they both get fertilized at the same time. Now, whether you have a dizygotic twin or a monozygotic twin, or just regular brother or sister, it's very likely that you're going to have a lot in common because you do share a lot of your experiences and you do share a lot of your genetic code with them. But one of the most important things that I want to make clear when it comes to all this discussion of genetics and, predispositions triggered by the environment and whatnot, is that just because it's in your genes, that doesn't mean it's going to happen. If you do have like a predisposition towards aggression, that doesn't mean you're going to act that way. Remember, DNA is just a probability. It's just a latent, like inherent, like predisposition. And if it doesn't get triggered, then it's not going to happen. Now, putting yourself in certain environments or being put in those environments can trigger those predispositions, but as a rational thinking adult, you can take advantage of this. You can understand yourself and prevent yourself from engaging in certain behavior by not placing yourself in those situations. So all I'm saying here is, just because your parents had it and their parents had it and it seems to run in your family, that doesn't mean you have to do it too. You can prevent that from happening by changing the situation, by changing the environment.